Let's face it, agile is no longer a new concept. Once upon a time, it was all the rage, the next new thing in project and program management circles. Now, for many, it's become table stakes. Scrum is one of the more popular agile methodologies and comes with a number of predefined team roles and prescribed Scrum ceremonies. In this episode of ideaBOX, my guests and I will explore a specific element of Scrum, the sprint review meeting, and we will convey why the sprint review is one of Agile's most powerful tools. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Victoria Bell to the program. Victoria is a veteran product manager at Smashing Boxes, and she shipped a number of products during her tenure. I would also like to welcome Jaylen Hatton to the program. Jaylen is a business analyst at Smashing Boxes, and he's on the product manager career track. In addition to supporting multiple product development efforts, Jaylen is leading and is soon to ship one of our strategic fintech products. As an aside, both Jaylen and Victoria are neck deep in building blockchain and crypto related products, but that's a topic for another time. So let's jump right into it. So starting off, I'm going to throw this first question to you, Victoria. How long have you been a Scrum practitioner?
Sure, yeah. I've been in product management for probably the entirety of my professional career, just about. But Scrum in particular, I've been practicing for about 5 years, give or take.
And Jaylen, how about you?
Yeah. So for me, I've been in a Scrum role for a little over 6 months now. I've definitely worked at several different tech companies that also practice agile methodologies, but I actually come from sort of like a business operations uh, background originally. So um, yeah, I'm 6 months into officially being, a part of a Scrum team.
Well, that's interesting. Just to follow up or follow on to that, given that you're quasi new to it, like how easy or difficult was it for you to pick it up?
That's a great question. For me, I feel like it was kind of easy to pick up, and don't get me wrong, it's definitely a lot of hard work because it's a fast-paced environment. But I think just naturally the way that we like to break our work into these like small, just sort of time box chunks, it just intuitively made sense to me. So yeah, I've enjoyed it. Like being 6 months in now, I don't think I'll ever want to practice anything else. So if that's any indicator.
Yeah. All right. Cool. So let's move on. You know, let's just I want to set the table for all the viewers because not everybody's going to be familiar with Scrum. And some of the things that we're going to be talking about, obviously the primary subject of this, which is the sprint review, meeting. I just want to sort of like lay like sort of like the groundwork for what is Scrum, and some of the attributes of it. So, Victoria, given that you're the veteran here, could you describe for me the key roles of a Scrum team?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually one of my favorite things about Scrum is that it is so straightforward, which I think is speaks to why Jaylen's able to pick it up so quickly. So the key roles in a Scrum team, there are three of them, and those are the product owner, the Scrum master, and the development team. Of course, the development team is comprised of many different specialties, but they're considered one role as just a multifunctional team working against a shared goal.
And if you could go a little bit deeper into that, can you sort of explain to our viewers, what the roles and responsibilities are for each of those key roles?
Yeah, absolutely. So the product owner, first and foremost, is responsible for the backlog. The product backlog is where we manage features and the priorities of those features that we plan to ship within the product lifecycle. So a primary responsibility for the product owner is finding where we are going to create the highest amount of value to our customer and our end user. Um, So they find value and they prioritize the tasks and features set accordingly. And then they explain that value to the development team. They ensure that value is conveyed and understood throughout the team, so everyone can organize and get motivated around what we are building and why we are building it. And the Scrum Master really helps the team to work as efficiently as possible. The development team is self-organized. They help indicate how they are going to work their best and most efficiently to get the key tasks, prioritized tasks completed. And the Scrum Master is very well connected and is very in tune to the day-to-day of the development team, and ensures that if any issues arise, they can help and unblock the team and just shepherd them in working as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, no, that totally resonates. Oftentimes when I describe this, I make a clear distinction between the how and the what. And from my perspective, I always say that the product owner is responsible for what is getting built, and the Scrum Master, is responsible for, how it gets built, and the mechanics of that. Jaylen, is there anything you want to add as it relates to, these roles?
No, I mean, I think you guys covered it all. I definitely, like you said, I resonate with sort of how Victoria described it. Like she said, it's really straightforward, right? It's not terribly complex, but it's extremely effective. So yeah, I don't have any other comments to add there.
Yeah. Well, one thing, and this is me going off the reservation a little bit, but I'll throw this out here to both of you guys. There's certainly a difference between, when you were on a product development team, versus in a consultant capacity, and you're actually serving a client. And so I guess if we could embellish on the product owner role a little bit, as it relates to, basically the difference between being a startup and being a product manager, product owner, and figuring out what features need to be, in your product to deliver the most value, with the least amount of cost, versus working with clients who have their own perspective on what they want built, and how that product owner role, sort of works as it relates to a client in a professional services environment.
Yeah, definitely. So, I think the primary distinction comes into play, when it comes time to develop our requirements, right? So, when we're dealing with an external client, effectively my job is to represent their interest to our development team, right? Full stop. Whereas if we don't have an external client, there's typically a little bit more work to be done in terms of doing our own research, developing our own set of requirements through that sort of process. And so that's kind of like the main distinction that I notice between the two.
Victoria?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just kind of jumping off of that point. Of course, if this was our own internal product, or we were product managers of our own product, it would be our responsibility to go out and understand the market and really be that voice of the end user. But also, even in that scenario, you're always going to have stakeholders. So I kind of consider it as, in client services, our client is kind of the ultimate stakeholder. So of course, they do have a lot of knowledge to bring in on what they think the requirements should be, what the priorities should be. So I kind of see it as a partnership to lean on them for their just internal business knowledge and just their knowledge of their customer base. But at the same time, exploring ideas together and pushing them on what brings most value to the product at the end of the day.
That's an excellent point. There was a really what I see as a clear jewel in something that you just said, and that's in terms of working with our clients as partners, and leveraging their domain expertise. And this is kind of a sidebar, but I'm often asked, do you guys have expertise in this industry or that industry or what have you? And the idea is that our expertise is in building digital products. Whether those are software products, hardware, IoT, et cetera. The point, for us is that we can sort of bind ourselves to the expertise, the domain expertise of any of our clients, no matter what their industry. And it's really, to use a Wu-Tang reference, form like Voltron into this, masterful product, development machine. And so that's an excellent point. And the product owner, product manager is the fulcrum of that from a client services perspective. So thank you for that. So
I was just waiting for when you were going to bring Wu-Tang into this. We're about a couple minutes in.
I was going to say, did we make 5 minutes in?
That's right. That's right. I'll find a Jay-Z reference soon enough.
That's right.
Yeah, that's funny. But okay, so that's great. So you guys have explained to us what the key roles of a Scrum team are. Now, Victoria, if you could sort of like walk us through what the key Scrum ceremonies are and give us an overview of them.
Sure, absolutely. So within the Scrum framework, there's a series of ceremonies, which essentially are meetings or just specific checkpoints that we have on a routine basis. And so those are sprint planning, the daily stand-up, the sprint review, and then the sprint retrospective. So yeah, just like really quickly at a high level, the sprint planning is the opportunity for the product owner to convey what the priorities are, talk through features and tasks with the development team, those which are high priority. And it gives the opportunity to the development team to ask questions, share their input, and just make sure that we're really aligned as a team on what we're building. And that, of course, occurs before we start a sprint. So then the development team will commit to what of those prioritized items do they believe they could accomplish within the fixed timeline of the sprint. And it's important that the development team makes that commitment on their own, rather than a product owner saying, hey, you need to accomplish this, this, and this in this next sprint. Kind of giving that responsibility to the development team really motivates them to complete it, since they actually had a say in what they would be capable of completing. Yeah. We don't force a commitment that they could never reach. Instead, it's one that they have said is reachable, and therefore, most times they make it happen because they're the ones.
That's really big for accountability. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And just that shared sense of responsibility. A Scrum framework is really big on letting everyone have a voice, really. So the development team's input is really important in this process. So planning is really a good opportunity to get that. The daily stand-up is a daily routine check-in, very short, 15 minutes max, maybe even that. And it's just an opportunity for everyone to update on what they've been doing. So usually the format is what you did yesterday, what you will do today, and then to raise any blockers or issues that you're experiencing. And it's really meant to be a quick update. And if there are any blockers that need a follow-up conversation, that can happen shortly after with those who are needed, and anyone else then can wrap up and get back to their work. What else do we have? Sprint review. So the next two are really important to the process, sprint review and sprint retrospective, and they're all about gathering feedback. So another really important factor in the Scrum framework is really short feedback loops. So the sprint review is an opportunity to get feedback on the product itself. So it's where the team can report on their progress, on what they're able to accomplish in the sprint, give a demo of what they have accomplished, and then to gather feedback from stakeholders and clients on what they've done so far. And then the sprint retrospective is also an opportunity for feedback, but rather than on the product itself, this is an opportunity for feedback on the team's process. So it's an opportunity for the development team to get together and discuss what went really well, what maybe could be improved upon, and then to leave that meeting with some actionable tasks that they could just slightly shift in their process to become even more efficient.
Yeah, that's a great way to explain it. And if our audience has heard nothing, hopefully they hear the word feedback loop and that resonates. One of the sort of the advantages of agile methodologies versus old school waterfall methodologies, is the fact that we've got these multitudes of tight feedback loops built into the system. And so if you get off course, it won't be weeks and months before you can course correct. There are opportunity to course correct at the granular level with the daily stand-ups. You can course correct daily with that. There's an opportunity to course correct, at a sort of like less granular, but still granular from the perspective of waterfall, at the sprint review meetings and the sprint retrospectives. And so, that's one of the reasons why, Scrum and Agile, tend to be, highly successful and produce positive results. So that's awesome. Anything on that front you want to share, Jaylen?
No, I think she really covered it all. I would also just emphasize the piece about everybody having a voice, in Scrum. I think that's also another really big, just theme within the principles of Scrum. But to that same point, I think it's also sometimes our responsibility to make sure we facilitate that, right? Because, over time you come across some team members are, a little bit more comfortable with maybe sharing, a difference of opinion and others aren't. And so I think oftentimes a product owner's role and along with the TPM can be to facilitate and make sure everybody's voice is heard.
Yeah. And that TPM, that's our internal role that we use to be Scrum Masters, the same way we use product managers and business analysts, to be product owners. That was a very clear description of the various ceremonies, and to bring us to the point of this particular episode. It's my contention that of all of the Scrum ceremonies that we have, and each of them has their own very specific purpose. But my contention is that the sprint review meeting is the most important Scrum ceremony as it relates to managing the client relationship. And so, Victoria, can you speak to that a little bit?
Oh, I was on mute. All right.
Yeah, it's all good.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's like we've been discussing, really, it's that opportunity for that feedback. So beyond that, of course, it is a progress update. So rather than a team just setting out to accomplish a goal, to build a product, and then, months and months and months go by, and then we don't check in with a client or with a stakeholder, then what happens is you would get to the end of that product development, you've reached the end of the timeline and you're ready to deliver. And then there might be some things that even if we did build what we set out to build, but then kind of seeing it all to come together, there might be some areas of improvement that we were just too up close to really notice. So having those routine check-ins and that, again, really short feedback loop is a really good opportunity to get client and stakeholder feedback early on in the process and just throughout the whole process, so we can iterate on it very quickly, and we can stay within that timeline and not realize things just at the very end, just to have that real-time iteration.
Right. No, definitely. I think that's a great point. Like, as you said, Victoria, it ensures that we don't get too far down the line and then figure out, we've gone astray from the client's vision. I also think too, the sprint review meeting is also important, sort of from that perspective of building this relationship as a partnership, right? So every time we come to the table at the sprint review meeting, in a sense, it gives us, space to collaborate with the partner, and for them to feel like, they're actively involved in the development process, which I think goes a long way in developing a lasting partnership.
It's also just exciting to see the working software,
right.
come together. Yeah, everyone loves to see the demo,
Right.
and it just builds that momentum, I think, on both sides, client side and team side.
Right.
Yeah, it's almost like I liken it to like new construction. If you're building a home and you go and you see like the foundation laid, and you might see the plumbing, there. You come back in a couple of weeks, it's framed out, and slowly but surely that house gets built. Right. So it's kind of like witnessing that. So it's good. I think a book that I recently read, it referenced something called the Rule of 60. And if I might screw this up, but according to this rule of 60, for every degree off, and for every, I guess, and this has to do with sailing, I think. So for every degree off, and for every, I think, I don't know if it was 24 hours or whatever, or some certain period of time, maybe it's every hour. So for every degree, you are, you'll travel 60 miles off course per hour, or whatever the time was. And so, having these sprint review meetings with the stakeholders, with the partner, with the client, presents the ability not only for us to share, with the progress, or share with the client, the stakeholder, the progress that we're making. But also, again, it's that critical feedback loop that, if we are getting anything wrong, or wrong isn't necessary, because that's kind of binary, something's correct or it's incorrect. If our interpretation of the requirements are slightly askew of the client partner, then we can resolve that and reconcile that, and get back on course. And so that's a super critical element of Scrum. Now that we've sort of, determined that, sprint review meetings, are a critical element, in Scrum. Let's talk about the anatomy, of a sprint review. And so, Jaylen, if you can, sort of like speak to that, what are the major aspects of a sprint review, and sort of what are the objectives of each aspect, of the sprint review?
Definitely. So, to start off, of course, every sprint review, we're going to open up sort of with an introductory sort of goal setting slide or conversation, right? So we're going to go over at a high level what we were trying to accomplish this sprint. And then I may go over a few key features or tasks that we really prioritize the sprint to make sure they got accomplished. So that's the first section is sort of goal setting, right? Followed by the goal setting, we typically go into the analytics next, right? So we're talking about looking at our velocity, burn down, burn up charts, our cumulative flow diagrams, these sorts of things, right? Which really are all like measures of the team's productivity, but just from different sort of vantage points, and looking at how successful we were at completing what we estimated during that sprint. And then after we get out of the analytics, we go into a more granular look at what we worked on. And for us, we look at each individual story that was completed, task that was completed, any bugs that may not have been completed, and just really try to point out any specific areas that we feel like, caused any real tension, or that may, need some further addressing in future sprints. And so once we've covered that, we kind of go from there into our actual demo, right? Which is the point that we get to show off what we've built, right? This is the point, like Victoria was saying, everybody enjoys the most. And so at that point, of course, it goes back to the same thing we all keep harping on, which is gathering feedback, right? So we'll typically have, somebody from the development team, actually use the product, and then we'll have the client or whomever the primary stakeholder is sort of stop and ask questions as we go along. And then as we finish the demo, then we kind of move to close. And for us, the close is all about, looking forward, right? So we'll do essentially a preview of the next sprint, and it'll be akin to sort of like that opening slide, right? So we'll say, here's the overarching goal that we're looking to accomplish next sprint. And then maybe here are a few features that we're going to prioritize along the way. So that's pretty much the anatomy of how we run our sprint review meetings and the objectives for each section.
Yeah, no, that's I think an excellent description and approach, and hopefully our viewers can walk away from this understanding what they should be expecting from their sprint review meetings. So yeah, cool. And I guess I do want to make this clear for the uninitiated. When Jaylen's talking about stories, he's talking about user stories. And from an agile Scrum perspective, a user story is akin to a requirement, but it's a particular format and a particular perspective on documenting requirements. That's typical in most agile environments. So Victoria, next question, for you, from a stakeholder client perspective, in your opinion, what is the value, of the sprint review to them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a very valuable session to have. Of course, like we've said, that opportunity to give feedback, but also from a client perspective, oftentimes you won't just be holding the sprint review for just your client. It's also an opportunity for them to invite stakeholders of their company. And it gives them that moment to kind of show what they've been working on with us. So again, it's a trust building opportunity for them to show this is, all of that hard work that we've been working on. This is what's come out of it. And here is actual piece of working software that we've built, a new set of features that we've built in the past 2 weeks. So that's a really good moment. And I think overall, it's just a communication opportunity. between the team and the client, or just any stakeholder really, or between the team itself, to have those routine check-ins. Of course, you hope we've always completely easily accomplished the entire goal, but of course there's opportunities where maybe there was a blocker along the way and there was something that we didn't quite finish. And we don't necessarily see that as a complete negative thing. It's an opportunity to bring that to the review and speak to it. Why didn't we accomplish this one task? And if it's a blocker on either side, that kind of puts it in everyone's face and really has like the tangible result of that blocker. Everyone just has to look at it, and then it motivates people to, all right, well, how do we fix that? So I think even the good or the bad, I think it's all good, because it's just an opportunity to communicate what's going on and everyone work together against that shared goal moving forward.
Absolutely. And, in terms of like blockers, oftentimes, at least, and I'll speak, from a smashing boxes perspective, oftentimes, if there are blockers on our side, really it's up to us, to sort of like resolve, any of those sort of internal impediments. And I say internal, I mean, on our side of the fence. And typically, if there are internal impediments, then, in a sprint review, we communicate that, hey, client, we acknowledge that this, is an impediment. We've got a plan to address it. We can share that plan with them. And again, that instills further confidence in our team. In the instances where those blockers are external, and they're not, our blockers, again, this is an opportunity for us to sort of, continue to further cement that partnership, with our clients, with our stakeholders and partners, and give them the opportunity and the awareness early to resolve any impediments on their side. Bad things and blockers will happen. And the worst thing that you can do is delay communicating, bad news. The sooner you can communicate bad news, or, if we even call it bad news, right, then the sooner people can work on resolving those issues. So, that's an excellent point of multiple points that you just made, about the value, of a sprint review rather, to a stakeholder partner or client. Jaylen, if you can take the opposite side of that, and sort of like go into the value from your perspective of the sprint review to the actual Scrum team.
Yeah, so that's actually a great question, because I think a lot of times, it's easy for us, I'm a business analyst, a lot of us think sort of analytically, to sort of forget about the like emotional aspect, I think, of building products, right? And so I could easily point out the fact that, of course, it allows us to course correct internally and sort of resolve any impediments, as you mentioned. But in my experience so far, I think one of the biggest benefits that the sprint review has given our team is like just building positive momentum, right? And whether that's, like Victoria said, some people get motivated just based on, okay, we did have a blocker or we had some kind of impediment, but the fact that we were able to discuss it as a team, now folks are really, jazzed to go and knock that out. Or sometimes it's just as simple as, hey, getting that pat on the back from the client, that positive reinforcement that what you did and what you've been working hard on is going really well. That also just, it builds on itself over time, to the point that it just becomes almost like a compounding effect of sorts. So,
yeah. So that, you kind of raise like the psychological implications, to the team. And it reminds me of the famous Navy SEAL who said, like, one of his like keys to success is that he makes his bed every morning, when he wakes up. And you start off with a win, right? And there are many, sort of like, books on success for teams and individuals that talk about like, celebrating the small wins, and those small wins accumulate, as in a snowball effect, into bigger wins. And so, I totally get that, like, the psychological benefits of actually showcasing, what you've accomplished, and getting the team even more excited to accomplish more and build on that, is very powerful. And, Jaylen, you and I were having a conversation recently about gamification, and the implications of that. But, when we look at the analytics that we showcase, during our sprint reviews, it's almost like video game scores, right? People want to, you want to do better. You want to match your previous score and that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of psychological value, as it relates to team motivation baked in that. No, you're laughing. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just laughing thinking back to the conversation you're referencing, because now that makes me feel like we need to add badges to the Scrum process.
Yeah. No. Well, so this is totally an aside. I'm sure at least one of my former colleagues and friends will be watching this. But in that environment with this former colleague that I won't name, and I won't name the company, somebody bought this trophy, and it was like a trophy of like some kind of a monkey with a crown on its head and a cape or whatever. And it was called, I forgot if it was called the Code Monkey or something like that. Right. But anybody on the engineering team who was responsible for breaking the build, they would get the Code Monkey placed on their desk, and it was a symbol of ridicule, derision, and shame.
Yeah, so, maybe not that badge. Maybe not that.
Positive reinforcement.
No doubt. Positive reinforcement. All right, cool. All right, let's see what's next. All right, so there's this notion of being a data-driven company that's pretty powerful, and it's certainly something that I'm a fan of. Jeff Jarvis goes deep, into this management philosophy in his book, What Would Google Do? I think I read that book like 10 years ago. Victoria, I'm going to throw this one to you. Can you speak to the value of data in managing team performance and leveraging that in a client relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just having data to back anything up it is always helpful. And I think it kind of brings a tangible component to the conversation. Of course, I can show up to a status review and say the team has been really productive this week. But what does that really mean? So putting some data back to it helps us really kind of track what does that mean? We've been really productive that week. That's great. And so we have various data points that is kind of like a shared language where we can understand really what do we mean, or did we increase our productivity or did we decrease our productivity?
Right. Excellent. As a follow-up to that, Jaylen, do you have an additional perspective you want to add?
No, I mean, I think, like she said, it's definitely just a great aid to the communication, right? To just remove any ambiguity that may come from differences in perspective. And then I guess if there's anything to add, it's just, sort of more so from the team management perspective, data just allows you to understand, sort of what you should be doing along the way. It takes the guesswork out of really getting a sense for, how high should our velocity be, or, how well we are actually performing within a given sprint. I think, again, the big thing is just it removes ambiguity for me as a manager.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful point, Victoria, in terms of like a shared language, a shared understanding, so that there's no confusion, no matter what the conversation is. And Jaylen, you just mentioned the term velocity. So I want to talk some about the specifics of Scrum. What is velocity? What does that mean, from a Scrum perspective?
Yeah, so the definition is basically the velocity is the number of story points that our Scrum team was able to achieve in a given sprint. Mm-hmm. Now, to take that a step further, what are story points, right? And what does that even mean? For us, story points are essentially like a degree of difficulty or a weight that we place to each given story requirement feature that we've decided to pull into the given sprint. And so as opposed to maybe saying, okay, at the end of our sprint, we were able to accomplish, 7 stories, we'll say we accomplished 25 story points, right? Because, each story obviously is going to vary in terms of its level of difficulty. So, I think it really just helps us measure how well we were accomplishing what we set out to or estimated at the beginning of the sprint.
Yeah, to continue on that a little bit, Victoria, Jaylen talked about story points as it relates to an individual sprint. But over the life of the sprint, what does velocity mean over the life of a sprint? And how does it relate to a team over the life of a sprint? And I guess where I'm going with this is, when a team first comes together, you probably really don't know what that team's velocity is. And if we think about, a marathon, runner or long distance runner, you don't know if that person can average, 20 miles an hour, or that's probably ridiculous. You don't know if they can, average like, 2 miles per hour or 1 mile per hour or whatever the case may be. And so, go into velocity a little bit further and how we use it to sort of like measure team performance.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, sure, when a team first comes together, it's hard to know what will their output be, what will their velocity be. And of course, we like to calculate an average velocity, and that helps us in planning. So when a team, let's say, has consistently been able to successfully accomplish 30 to 40 story points, then that's a pretty good baseline when planning the next sprint. How much can we commit to? So it's a tool to help the team decide what they can commit to. But also, as we've talked about, we have very short feedback loops within the Scrum process. So not only on the product, but on the process. So I know I touched on the sprint retrospective earlier, but so in the retro, the team is constantly iterating and improving upon their own process. So you'd actually hope to see velocity improve and start going up over the full product development lifecycle. Sprint 1, the team might have a velocity of 30, but hopefully by sprint 9, they've improved upon their process. They've really gelled together as a team and learned how they can work as efficiently as possible. And hopefully it's gone up, and their average has been increasing slowly as they continue to improve their process and work together.
Yeah. And so just to I guess put a point on that, if this velocity was, at a certain level, call it here, at sprint 0, and then, by the time sprint 9 came, the velocity was here, and it was a steady uptick. At some point, if this, let's just call it like a 50 per sprint, or 50 sprint, I'm sorry if I could speak. It was a 50 sprint engagement. At some point it would stabilize, right? The idea is that,
Sure.
it would flatten out, and that, we could very easily predict how many story points, what the productivity of that team was going to be on a per sprint basis. And that's, again, another powerful Scrum tool.
Exactly. And it just helps us in planning, when planning the full roadmap for the product and product delivery, it helps us really gauge where those milestones are, just being able to predict what this team can produce and how quickly.
That's right. And so we didn't go deep into it because we didn't talk financials. But one of the, the product management, responsibilities obviously is to manage a budget and build, a product according to a budget. And the ability to plan, in a precise manner as possible helps to manage the budget, in a precise management or a precise way possible. So that's a very powerful tool, from that perspective. So, speaking of velocity and speaking of user stories and points, Jaylen, why don't you walk us through, what is a burn down chart, what it's meant to convey, to a product owner and the rest of the Scrum team, what it conveys to a stakeholder, a client. And then, at the end of that, talk about a burn up chart in the same way.
Yeah, so a burn down chart can measure a couple of things, right? So one, it can be a burn down chart for stories, for tasks, or for bugs even. And essentially what it does is it measures the team's progress throughout the sprint sort of against what our estimated commitment was, right? And so ideally what you want to see when you look at a burn down chart is sort of like this incremental, step down as we, accomplish stories or accomplish tasks, that we pulled into this sprint. Sort of similarly, the burn up chart is meant to convey, again, sort of this similar like gradual increase as we go through the sprint and completion of tasks and stories, but just from a slightly different perspective. But yeah, so that's kind of like in a nutshell, what we use our burn up and burn down charts for.
Yeah. So what that, for the layman, if I might translate, then it seems like the burn down chart is you've got this like mountain of, let's call it like, dirt. And that's your task, is to remove that dirt. And so if you're shoveling that, and moving it somewhere else, like over time, that mountain is going to slightly, diminish and get smaller. And so that's the perspective of looking at your workload as it's this big mountain that you need to, sort of like, or tree or whatever that you need to chop down. Chopping down trees is not green. Let's stick with the moving dirt. You need to move this mountain of dirt, and slowly but surely it flattens out, to the surface when you've got it complete. And you want to see that as smooth as possible over time. Whereas the burn up chart, that's you need to actually build a mountain, right? That's the perspective of the mountain's not there, and so you need to move some earth, you need to move some dirt, and build a mountain. And again, we would hope that over time that graph is smooth. So those are good tools for the team to rally around to understand what their performance looks like. I guess, Victoria, if you're with your team at the end of the sprint, and I know this isn't about retrospectives, but if you were like, to discuss the burn down chart with your team, if your burn down chart looked like, sort of like an elliptical graph, what does that indicate to your team, and what might you, coach them on as it relates to that?
Yeah, I mean, again, like these charts are just like really helpful visual representations of how productive a team was. So, noting on what might stand out at the end of a sprint. Sure, like we want to see the burn down chart go down incrementally, because we want to be accomplishing tasks and moving on to the next, accomplishing and moving on to the next. Just having these small chunks of work that we can incrementally complete. So of course, you don't want to see a burn down chart that just looks like a cliff and goes straight down at the very end. It definitely happens sometimes, but that would definitely be a conversation in the retro of how can we start finishing things quicker and just incrementally rather than spending the 2 weeks having everything in progress. Because it's nice to be able to prioritize the team's focus. Of course, in a sprint, they're working on the current priorities, but even within that sprint, it is nice for someone on the team and the team to be able to rally around a task, finish it, move on to the next, finish it, move on to the next, rather than be working on multiple things at once. So that's why we like to see those steps down.
Very cool. Thanks. Continuing with Victoria, can you speak to the value of the feedback loop from a product owner perspective in managing the client relationship?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Feedback is just paramount, as I think we've discussed multiple times today. So from managing the client perspective, it definitely generates trust. If the client gives us feedback and then in the next sprint review, we're able to show them that we've already accomplished what they've given us feedback on, it shows definitely that we're listening and that we understand their needs. And then also it just shows kind of how iterative we can be. And to not be scared of making mistakes or getting things slightly off the first time. Because if we just wait until we have full grasp on every single detail of every single requirement, then we're going to be writing requirements for a while. It's kind of the waterfall approach. It's better, and it's definitely the agile approach to just dive in and fail, because you're always going to fail to some degree, but just do it quickly so that you can course correct quickly as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that. I love that answer. And in terms of the same thing, managing the team relationship, with the feedback loop, we've touched on it before, but do you have any overarching, Victoria, any overarching sort of perspective on those feedback loops for managing the team?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's equally as important, if not even more important. The team, each individual team member has a voice on a Scrum team. And I think that's extremely important. There's people that are working very hard on a shared goal together. But if it's something that they're going to spend 40 hours on of their week, then you want to make sure that it's something that they're enjoying doing, and also that they understand the value behind something. And if they think there's a better way to do it, we want to hear that.
That's right.
I think it's definitely important in our role to lead with empathy and always understand, what a team member might be thinking, or if there's something else on the process that isn't working for them. It's important to know, because their happiness is ultimately going to lead to their productivity and a better product in the end.
Yeah, no doubt. All right, excellent. you guys are obviously like, on top of your game, which is why I invited you here to have this conversation with me, and for our ideaBOX viewers. Before we close out, though, I wanted to actually, use some, sort of artifacts or some visuals to sort of like showcase, the smashing boxes approach to sprint review meetings. And not that we're going to go through an entire, sprint review deck, but I just wanted to showcase some of the analytics. And so, Jaylen, if you wouldn't mind, walking us through, some of these analytics, just, give a brief description of what, how this would work. So, I'm just going to like walk through these slides and you just speak to them.
Cool. So, typically we start out with velocity. Now, I will say, sort of for like the uninitiated, or just for anyone who didn't have context of this actual sprint, this number by itself doesn't necessarily mean a ton. But later on, in this sort of section of our sprint review deck, we'll see, how this 42 points that we achieved in velocity this sprint compared to previous sprints. So typically when I speak to this, though, the team that I'm speaking to, kind of has a sense of how that compares, right? And so this is sort of like, again, the first slide to just establish what our productivity was during the sprint.
Gotcha.
Now, this is looking at the number of story points, not only that we completed, but we attempted and that we estimated. So this obviously falls right out of the velocity, but it takes a slightly deeper look at it. And so there are a couple of things that I like to highlight. The first thing that I typically go for is looking at the points completed versus the points attempted, simply because one, that tells us, how much of a workload we tried to achieve in the, at the outset of the sprint, but also just how precise we were in our estimation. So this is a number, that you want to see the delta decrease, from one sprint to the next, ideally. The next sort of thing that I'll point out here is the points not started, right? Because the first question that you should inherently ask when you see, 5 story points not started is, well, is there a blocker, right? And sometimes that is the case. And I may speak to that here, or I may, go deeper in a later section of our sprint review, but that is what that essentially depicts. And then, of course, we also have points in progress, which is probably the more ambiguous sort of tile here of the 4. But typically when I call this one out, it's usually to give a sense of, hey, we've had some stories or some tasks that are in progress, but maybe they, got all the way to QA, right? They got all the way to the point of being tested. And so they're close to being done, but technically they're still in progress. So that's kind of how I go through, this slide, looking at our story point analytics.
If I bring you in here for a second, Victoria, if we were looking at this and the, I guess the points attempted, were lower than the points completed, what might that indicate?
Yeah, I mean, if the points attempted is lower than what we ultimately completed, I mean, that's good news, because that just means that we started the sprint with a commitment and then we actually completed it ahead and we're able to work ahead and pull even more into the sprint. Right. So just kind of what is just in the backlog that is a priority that maybe is just sitting at the top, just barely didn't make it. And then the team is always welcome to, if they're ahead, continue working down that list as it is just pre-prioritized in this event.
Now, what if the team consistently was in that situation? What would that indicate?
That would indicate that we should add some more points next planning, because their velocity is increasing, and so they can actually take it more, commit to more.
Yeah. No, I'll use some spades terminology. That would be sandbagging. The team is sandbagging. Right. All right. No, cool. All right. So, all right, Jaylen, speak to this this slide.
Yeah. So the velocity report, and this is, really pointing at something that I was referencing a second ago, which is, in order to really appreciate and understand, the team's velocity, you really should be comparing it to the previous velocity, right? And so what this report does for us is it shows us, starting at sprint 0, all the way up to, in this case, sprint 3, on the left-hand side what our, our committed amount of story points would have been for the sprint, and then the amount of story points that we actually achieved, hence the velocity. So, in a case like this is typically one of those moments where I take out some time for a little bit of positive reinforcement, because this sort of like, gradual increase, and that, again, sort of like that decrease in the delta between that sort of estimated story points versus the actual completed, is getting smaller over time. So yeah, this is just a slide that I really use to contextualize the velocity of this sprint compared to the velocity of previous sprints.
Yeah, I think I'll point out here that some people, may look at this and say, well, wow, the commitment was so large, but the team failed to, like in, let's just say sprint 0, they failed to like hit the commitment. And then there was a significant delta in the second sprint as well. And from my perspective, that's a totally, sort of like short-sighted way of looking at this. I like bold, ambitious teams, right? Not blindly bold and ambitious, but the sandbagging is not a behavior that we want to encourage. And so we want to encourage teams to be bold and not feel like they failed if they didn't achieve the velocity that they set out to achieve. And even in this, though, you can see over time, right, the commitment, the estimation is closer to the actual, and over time that's just going to smooth out. So this is actually a very successful velocity report as it stands for this team. We mentioned burn up charts before, and speak to this slide, Jaylen.
Yeah, so this is our burn chart for our stories, or for our story points, right? So this is also sort of looking at velocity in a slightly different way. But what we have here at the top with this red line is what our estimate was, right? So estimated originally at 50 story points. And then you'll see this sort of notch up here toward the end, which most likely indicates that for whatever reason there were some additional stories pulled into the sprint toward the end, which is not typical, but it can happen, given the right circumstance. And then the green line we have here down at the bottom is the actual number, right? So as we complete stories, you'll see the green line sort of notch up a little bit, and then the next time we complete stories, it notches up again. And then here, I will point out that looking at this chart specifically, we don't necessarily have the smoothest of sort of declines in terms of accomplishing the story points, which is not ideal, but it's something that we can definitely work through. Like Victoria said, all this is just, it gives us something to look at for our sprint retro, and that would just be a topic of discussion. How do we smooth out burn up?
Well, this is a great example, I think, because this is the third sprint of a brand new team that was put together. And so obviously what this is indicating is that, on the last day of the sprint, like, many stories, were accepted or completed at the last day. And so over time, we would expect this to improve. So I think, it's a great example, as opposed to showing like some perfect, graph. Like this is like a real life situation. Let me move to the burn down chart. So, talk about this, from the perspective of how it, basically, represents a completely different perspective on what you just talked about in the burn up chart.
That's right. So with our burn down chart, kind of like you were alluding to earlier, this is about sort of looking at it from the perspective of having this mountain of work or story points or features, that we're looking to gradually decrease over time. And so this chart here is essentially, through this red line, is showing us, what the total, again, estimated amount of story points were at the beginning. And then as we complete stories, it gradually reduces, what that number is. And of course, again, this looks a little funny, right? Because it's like, okay, well, how does it, actually go up at a certain point? But again, it goes back to the reality in this case, which was, we actually added some stories after the sprint had already begun. And so again, like you said, it's really speaking to sort of the same thing, but from a sort of an inverse perspective, to look at, again, how well we were able to progress throughout the sprint.
Excellent. And the last chart is the cumulative flow diagram. If you could speak to that, what this means, how we use it, and so on.
Right. So this is one of my favorite charts, I guess, within this sort of like collection of analytics. And it's because it allows us to take a sort of like a 10,000 foot view, if you will, just across all of the sprints, throughout the entire phase that we've been working. And so what you see here is, of course, several different colors that represent, different statuses of essentially the work that we have, to do. And so basically, you'll see in the beginning, it's all purple, which means everything is to do. We only have cards written, but we haven't actually pushed anything into progress. And then, of course, the green on the other end of the spectrum is, things that are completed. And so what you want to see here is, gradually over time, this margin between sort of the I guess you would say the upward bound of the purple and the upward bound of your green section should be as close as possible. I mean, at the end, you want it all to be green effectively, which would represent, a completed set of stories and features.
Yeah,
something I always like to point out on this as well is if you look at the colors that are representing ready for QA, in QA, and PO review, is how small little slices those are. And I think that always really speaks to how quickly, if something is ready for QA, QA grabs it. Quick feedback. If it's ready for the product owner to review it, that's what PO review represents. The product owner looks at it and it either marks it as done or moves it back to in progress if there's something that needs to be addressed. So things don't just like hang out waiting for review for very long at all. Those quick feedback loops are shown again within the sprint.
That's an excellent point, because if they were like, if those were fatter than what they are, that would indicate, performance inefficiencies, in the team. And so, that's very wise and sage, to point out. I think, for the uninitiated, at the very beginning of an engagement, this entire graph or this entire diagram would be purple. Everything would be, to do. And this represents basically the backlog of stories. And the reason why it isn't flat is because over time, we're always, we're fleshing out, user stories. We might have certain, non-granular stories that get broken up into like 3 or 4, separate stories at a granular level. And, people who are familiar with agile and Scrum, if something gets pointed out as like a 30-point, 20-point story or something like that, you'll typically want to break those up into more bite-sized chunks. And so that's why that graph, or that's one of the reasons why the purple, isn't a flat line, but it sort of like increases over time. But that's exactly right. That's what you want to see. And at the very end, the green would overtake the purple at a release. So that's cool. All right, very sweet. Thank you, Jaylen and Victoria for walking the audience through that. I'll just wrap this up by saying that I'll reiterate the fact that I believe, particularly from a client and stakeholder perspective, the most important tool in Agile is the sprint review meeting, is the sprint review. It is the cadence at which the stakeholders can all be made aware of the progress. They can touch and feel the progress via the demo. From a Smashing Boxes perspective, we deal in data, and so we provide analytics so that it's not our perspective or opinion that we're progressing. It is empirical, and that's how we roll. We roll with empiricism over here. So I'd like to thank you both, Jaylen and Victoria, for your time and for your insights. And this has been a very enjoyable conversation. So thank you, guys.
Yeah, agreed. It's been great.
Yeah, same here. Thanks for having us.
All right, cool. Well, I can't wait for the next one. Anyway, see you guys.
All righty. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.